The livers were the basis of the analysis because PCBs are stored in fatty tissue and liver has a high fat content. Liver tissue samples were collected from the animals, fish and waterfowl. Liver is also relevant for human exposure since this organ is regularly consumed as well as the heart and marrow. Elders reminded us that traditional values teach us to use everything that the animal has to offer. Many Mushkegowuk peoples continue this tradition today.
Also placed in a plastic bag like this with all the coding and sampling and the name and the date. It's ready to be sent.
Where the animals were harvested, the wildlife specimens were collected within 15 kilometers or 9 miles from each radar site. Animals and plants selected for PCB testing were chosen based on preferred food items from the participating First Nations as well as keystone species that are important to local ecosystems. Soil, water, and plants were also tested for fuel contamination. Species-specific guidelines for acceptable PCB levels in wildlife, fish, and vegetation in the Mushkegowuk territory do not exist. In order to assess a level of concern, the federal maximum residue limit for PCBs in beef and other meat under the Food and Drug Administration and regulations was used for comparison. This maximum residue limit is 0.2 parts per million for PCBs and was used as a gauge for assessing the wildlife tissue results. PCBs were not detected in the animals, plants, or soils except for one soil sample at Site 050 Port Albany, the only site across Mushkegowuk that has been remediated. However, there is still fuel contamination in the plants at Site 050 Port Albany. The extent of Site 500 PCB contamination is greater than previously understood, with water, soil, and vegetation samples exceeding the Ministry of Environment agricultural PCB criteria. The wildlife samples from Site 500 were below the Health Canada standard with only trace amounts of PCB contaminations. Shorebirds and frog samples did, however, reveal greater than trace PCB concentrations. PCBs have entered the food chain at Site 500 Winnesk. Vegetation across Site 415 consistently demonstrated high levels of PCBs and represent a serious contamination issue. A separate study from the University of Waterloo found only trace amounts of PCBs in the breast tissue of geese harvested at Site 415. Site 060 Relay demonstrated the greatest PCB contamination, and the results confirmed transfer into the food chain and country foods. Our results confirm very high levels of PCB in rabbits, as well as sharp-tailed grouse, weasels, and fox. One weasel sample demonstrated PCB levels 15 times greater than the Health Canada standard, and water samples 6,000 times greater than the government standards. The soil at the study sites was tested for PCB and fuel contamination. Soil PCB contamination was detected across all 3 abandoned radar sites. Fuel contamination was detected at all 4 sites. All of the sites have well installations from previous site assessment work. These well installations provide information on how deep the contamination has traveled to the earth. These wells were installed on Sites 415, Site 500, Site 050, and the relay site 060. Soil is tested from 1 foot below the surface to 15 feet below the surface. Once the soil samples have been collected, a pipe is inserted into the hole and it becomes a water monitoring well that can be checked for several years. Water can be retrieved from these wells and are tested for various types of contaminants. The wildlife harvester's role in the Mid-Canada Line radar site project is to harvest animals that dwell within or near the abandoned radar sites. The collection of wildlife samples from each community were performed by local harvesters who are still actively hunting, fishing and trapping. The harvesters are also familiar with the site locations. Liver tissues were selected to be used for PCB testing. The livers were the basis of the analysis because PCBs are stored in fatty tissue and liver has a high fat content. Liver tissue samples were collected from the animals, fish and waterfowl. Liver is also relevant for human exposure since this organ is regularly consumed as well as the heart and marrow. Elders reminded us that traditional values teach us to use everything that the animal has to offer. Many Mushkegowuk peoples continue this tradition today.
Also placed in a plastic bag like this with all the coding and sampling and the name and the date. It's ready to be sent.